I've always hated flying. It's not the fear of crashing that gets to me, but the sheer, undeniable claustrophobia of being trapped in a metal tube, miles above the earth with absolute strangers. You have no control. You have nowhere to run. On a rainy Tuesday in November, I was booked on a red-eye flight from Seattle to Newark. It was a Boeing 737, the kind of narrow-body aircraft that feels tight even when it's empty. And this flight was far from empty. It was fully booked. I was seated in 34A, pinned against the window in the second-to-last row of the plane. The smell of stale coffee and recycled air was already giving me a headache before we even pushed back from the gate. As the final passengers boarded, dragging their wet luggage down the narrow aisle, I prayed the seat next to me would miraculously remain empty. But my luck ran out when a man stopped at my row. He didn't say a word. He just stood there staring down at the empty middle seat, 34B. He was tall, unsettlingly thin, wearing a faded gray trench coat that was soaking wet, despite the fact that we had boarded through a covered jet bridge. His skin was pale, almost translucent under the harsh cabin lights, and his eyes were locked forward, unblinking. I pulled my knees in so he could slide past, but he didn't acknowledge me. He simply folded his long limbs into the middle seat, sitting perfectly rigid, his hands resting flat on his thighs. We took off, the engine roaring, the cabin plunging into the dim, blue-tinted darkness of a night flight. For the first 2 hours, I tried to sleep. I pressed my head against the cold plastic of the window pane, closing my eyes, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. You know that primal instinct? That crawling sensation at the base of your neck when someone's eyes are boring into you. I turned my head slightly. The man in 34B had his head turned at an unnatural angle, staring directly at my profile. The cabin was dark, illuminated only by the scattered glow of reading lights and seatback screens, but I could see the faint glint of his eyes. He wasn't watching a movie, he wasn't sleeping. He was just staring at me. "Can I help you?" I whispered, trying to keep my voice down so as not to wake the woman sleeping in the aisle seat. He didn't answer. His lips barely moved. But I heard a sound. A low, wet whispering, like paper tearing. It was so faint I had to lean in slightly to hear it over the drone of the jet engines. He was reciting something. 1242 Elm Street, he whispered. "Blue door. The lock on the back gate is broken." My blood ran ice cold. That was my address. That was my house. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. "How do you know that?" I hissed, panic rising in my throat. I looked around for a flight attendant, but the aisle was completely empty. The seatbelt sign was illuminated due to mild turbulence. We were suspended in the dark sky, completely isolated. He didn't blink. He just leaned an inch closer, the smell of damp earth and copper radiating from his coat. "You left the porch light on," he breathed. "But the basement is dark. It's always dark when they wait for you." I couldn't take it anymore. I scrambled over the sleeping woman in the aisle seat, not caring that I kicked her knee. I practically sprinted down the narrow aisle to the rear galley, my hands shaking uncontrollably. A flight attendant was sitting on a jump seat, reading a magazine. "There's something wrong with the man sitting next to me," I gasped, pointing a trembling finger down the dark cabin. "He knows where I live. He's threatening me." The flight attendant frowned, putting her magazine down. "Sir, please calm down. What seat are you in?" 34A, I said, my chest heaving. The guy in 34B, he's insane. She looked at me, a deep crease forming between her brows. She reached up and pulled back the curtain, looking down the aisle toward the back of the plane. Then she looked back at me, her expression shifting from annoyance to deep concern. "Sir," she said softly, her voice wavering just a fraction. "Row 34 is the last row of the plane, and 34B is empty. It's been empty the entire flight." I pushed past her, marching back down the aisle. My heart was in my throat. I reached row 34. The aisle seat was occupied by the sleeping woman. My jacket was still resting in the window seat, but the middle seat, 34B, was completely empty. There was no sign of the pale man in the gray coat. But as I leaned over to grab my jacket, my hand brushed against the seat cushion of 34B. It was soaking wet. And resting right in the center of the damp cushion was the spare key to my back gate. I was working as a flight attendant for a major international carrier, assigned to a Boeing 777 flying from London to Boston. It was the middle of winter, a brutal overnight route that most of the crew dreaded. The flight was only half full, mostly business travelers and people heading home for the holidays. By 2 a.m., we were cruising at 36,000 feet, somewhere over the freezing, pitch-black expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The cabin was dead quiet. The lights were dimmed to a soft amber, and almost every passenger was asleep. My colleague Mark and I were in the rear galley drinking bitter airline coffee to stay awake. That's when the first call bell chimed. A soft, high-pitched ding that echoed through the quiet cabin. I looked at the monitor. It was row 42, seat J. Right side of the aircraft, near the back. I grabbed a bottle of water, assuming someone just needed a drink, and made my way down the dark, narrow aisle. The hum of the engines was a constant, steady vibration under my feet. When I reached row 42, I stopped. The entire row was empty. The blankets were neatly folded, the seat belts crossed perfectly over the cushions. I sighed, figuring someone had hit the button by mistake while walking to the lavatory. I reached up and pressed the button to turn off the light. As soon as my finger left the plastic, another chime echoed through the cabin. Ding. This time it was row 41, seat J. The row directly in front of me. I stepped forward, empty, no passengers. I turned the light off. Ding. Row 40, seat J. A cold knot formed in my stomach. The plane was dark, the air dry and recycled, but a sudden chill washed over me. I looked down the aisle. The seats were tall enough that I couldn't see the tops of people's heads unless they were sitting up straight. But the right side of the aircraft in this section was completely devoid of passengers. We had grouped everyone closer to the front for weight distribution. Ding. Row 39, seat J. Someone was moving up the aisle, pressing the call buttons one by one, but I couldn't see anyone. I walked faster, my low heels sinking into the carpet. "Is someone there?" I whispered, my voice swallowed by the drone of the engines. Ding! Row 38, seat J. I broke into a light jog, reaching row 38. Empty. But the tray table was down, and sitting in the center of the plastic tray is a small Polaroid photograph. My hands trembled as I picked it up. The cabin was dim, so I held it up toward the window, letting the faint moonlight catch the glossy surface. It was a photo of me, standing in the galley, drinking coffee with Mark. It had been taken from the perspective of the dark aisle, looking back at us. But that was impossible. Mark and I had been facing the aisle the entire time. No one had been there. I shoved the photo into my apron pocket and turned around, intending to run back to the galley to show Mark, to call the captain. But as I turned, I slammed right into a passenger. He was standing dead center in the aisle, blocking my path. He was wearing a dark, heavy coat, with the hood pulled up over his head. His head was bowed, his face entirely in shadow. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. "Sir," I managed to say, my voice trembling so violently I barely recognized it. "Sir, you need to return to your seat." He slowly raised his head. Where his face should have been, there was nothing but a smooth, featureless expanse of pale, tightly stretched skin. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a blank, its terrifying canvas of flesh. I screamed, stumbling backward, tripping over a passenger's bag that was sticking out into the aisle. I hit the floor hard, scraping my hands against the rough carpet. I scrambled backward like a crab, scrambling frantically until I hit the bulkhead wall. I looked up, gasping for air, tears stinging my eyes. The aisle was empty. The man was gone. Mark came running down the aisle a few seconds later, a flashlight in his hand, asking what had happened. I couldn't speak. I just sat there on the floor, shaking, pointing at the empty aisle. When we finally got back to the galley, I reached into my pocket to show Mark the photograph. I pulled it out and slammed it onto the metal counter, but the image had changed. It was no longer a picture of me in the galley. It was a picture of me, asleep in my own bed at home, taken from the corner of my bedroom ceiling. I fly out of O'Hare every other week for my consulting job. I've logged so many hours in the air that planes feel more like waiting rooms than miracles of engineering. You get used to the routines, the noises, the subtle shifts in cabin pressure. You learn to tune out the crying babies and the nervous flyers. But I will never, ever tune out what happened on Flight 819 to London. It was a Boeing 787 Dreamliner. I was sitting in the premium economy section, enjoying the extra legroom in seat 14D, an aisle seat right near the mid-cabin lavatories. The flight was uneventful for the first 5 hours. We were high above the Atlantic, deep into the night, the cabin dark and silent. I had been reading on my tablet, occasionally glancing up at the occupied sign on the lavatory directly in front of my section. It had been glowing red for over an hour. At first, I didn't think much of it. People fall asleep, they get sick, things happen. But as another hour passed, I noticed the flight attendants glancing at it as they walked by. A young flight attendant named Chloe finally stopped, knocking gently on the folding door. "Sir or ma'am, is everything all right in there?" she asked, keeping her voice low. There was no response, just the constant deafening hum of the jet engines outside the reinforced hull. She knocked harder. "Passenger in the lavatory, please respond." Still nothing. She looked back at me, giving me a tight, professional smile that didn't quite reach her terrified eyes. She unclipped a radio from her hip and called the purser. A few minutes later, a senior flight attendant arrived with a small metal tool. "We're going to unlock the door," he announced loudly, pressing his face close to the slats in the door. "Stand back, please." He inserted the tool into a hidden slot under the metal placard and twisted. With a sharp click, the lock disengaged. The red light flipped to green. The door slid open with a soft hiss of air pressure. I leaned out into the aisle, my curiosity getting the better of my manners. I expected to see someone passed out on the floor, or worse, a medical emergency. But the lavatory was completely empty. The lights were on, the mirror was clean, the toilet seat was down. There was absolutely no one inside. The flight attendants exchanged confused looks. "Faulty lock," the senior purser muttered, though he looked visibly shaken. He reached in, flipped the switch to turn the light off, and slid the door shut. 10 minutes later, I was trying to focus back on my tablet when I heard a sound. It was faint, barely audible over the roar of the engines, but it was coming from inside that lavatory. It sounded like fingernails scratching frantically against the inside of the door. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I froze. I looked up at the sign. It had flipped back to red. Occupied. I stood up, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I stepped into the aisle and pressed my ear against the cold, plastic folding door of the lavatory. The scratching stopped immediately. "Hello?" I whispered. From the other side of the door, a voice whispered back. It was a voice I hadn't heard in 15 years. It was my mother's voice. She had died in a car crash when I was 20. "Julian," she whispered, her voice distorted, as if bubbling up through thick water. "Julian, it's so cold out here in the dark. Please open the door. I can't breathe." I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet, crying out in sheer terror. The flight attendants rushed over, demanding to know what was wrong. I couldn't form sentences. I just pointed frantically at the red light. The senior purser, looking angry now, grabbed his tool and violently popped the lock open again, yanking the door wide. Empty. The tiny, brightly lit room was completely empty. But this time, the mirror above the sink was completely fogged over, as if someone had just taken a boiling hot shower and written backward in the condensation, trailing off at the bottom as if dragged by a desperate finger, were the words, "Don't look out the window." I collapsed into my seat, burying my face in my hands, unable to stop shaking. I kept my eyes clamped shut for the remaining 3 hours of the flight. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just listened to the engines roar, praying for the wheels to touch down. When we finally landed, I practically ran off the plane, ignoring the flight attendants, who asked if I needed medical assistance. As I walked up the jet bridge, I made the mistake of glancing back through the terminal window at the plane. There, standing on the wing of the aircraft, completely oblivious to the roaring jet engines and the ground crew, was a figure in a gray dress, staring directly at me through the glass. It was my mother, and she was smiling a smile with far too many teeth. If these airplane horror stories made you think twice about booking your next window seat, hit that like button and subscribe for more terrifying true encounters. Have you ever experienced something unexplainable at 30,000 feet? Tell me your story in the comments below. If you're brave enough to remember.